Hello and welcome to the Genuine Learning Blog. My name is Melissa Galasso, and I'm really excited to talk to you about a recent decision that was made by the GASB. So on Monday, GASB met and approved the new implementation guide. That should probably come out, I would say probably either late this month or early next month. But it addresses a very hot topic question that we want you guys to be aware of. And it is around SBITAs. So the implementation guide was proposed back in October of 2023. Comments were due in January. However, they did put out an additional comment for another question for comment with a little bit of a later date. And so they just got around to having their meeting. So they met back in March and they went over each question. And then on Monday, they went through and voted to approve the implementation guide with the questions and the changes that were in there. And remember, implementation guides are considered authoritative guidance. So the question that was asked in the implementation guide, that is everybody's question, which is a licensing agreement for a vendor's computer software that automatically renews until canceled a licensing agreement that provides a perpetual license? Now, that question in and of itself is not exactly everybody's top question because most people would recognize that no, a provision with where you have a licensing agreement that automatically renews until cancels is an option to terminate at each renewal date. And so that is something that's new. That is a very important statement that is being made in this implementation guide. It's saying that if you have an automatic renewal, it is an option to terminate each reporting period. However, what they went on to say was that an option to terminate is not a purchase, which we would all agree. And whereas a perpetual license is a purchase, therefore automatic renewals are not perpetual. And we all know that, right? So if you don't renew, you're not going to get to keep the software. In a perpetual license, you get to keep the software. So I don't think the question was really around whether or not it was perpetual license, but a lot of it was around, well, what is the term in this scenario? As evidenced by the comment letter, this comment letter came from Visual Lease, and Visual Lease said they agree with the answer to question 4.7 that an unlimited automatic renewal does not create a perpetual license. So everyone's on board. They agreed. However, we are concerned the underlying question remains unresolved, which is what duration should be used for creating the Statement 96 schedule. Our opinion is that determining the appropriate period is complex and does not lend itself to a simple formulaic answer. I have heard people just say, hey, if it's an option to renew, it's an option to terminate, it's automatically a short-term lease. And I take a little bit of issue with that automatic in there because there is guidance in the standard that gives two different considerations for options to terminate. So in this scenario, they did raise the question. However, on June 5th, when they had their meeting this Monday, they affirmed the language with no changes. And I know that the GASB staff, because it was a topic of conversation in March around, well, what does it mean to have the automatic renewals? But again, that really wasn't the question. The question was, is it perpetual? The answer is clearly no. That's what the Q&A says. So it is achieving its purpose. But what it's not doing is answer what most people want to know, which is, how do we treat this? So then we have to go look at the guidance. And so first off, if it's an option to terminate under GASB 96, and only the government has that option, right? So it says the subscription term is the period during which the government has a non-cancelable right to use the underlying asset. All right, so that's a starting point, plus the following periods. And so I kind of cut out the two that were options to renew and just kept the options to terminate. Periods covered by a government's option to terminate if it is reasonably certain, based on all relevant factors, that the government will not exercise that option. And period covered by the SBITA's vendor's option to terminate the SBITA if it's reasonably certain, based on all relevant factors, that the SBITA vendor will not exercise. And so in this scenario, if the government has an option to terminate, but the government the government has the option to terminate, but the vendor does not, then that is an option to terminate, and we have to evaluate whether it is reasonably certain to exercise or not exercise that option. On the other hand, if it's the SBITA vendor's option and the government doesn't have it, which would be very strange, then obviously we would have to evaluate. But I think it would be very rare what government would want to enter into a contract where the vendor can terminate, but we can't, right? That would be kind of strange. But I do see the potential for an option for the government to terminate, whereas the vendor cannot. And so in that scenario, we have to consider whether it is reasonably certain. On the other hand, if both entities, both the government and the SBITA vendor, have an option to terminate without permission from the other party, then that is a cancelable period and are excluded from the subscription term. So the standard talks about month-to-month types of options here, but that's not typically how these work, because if it's going to renew and it's an annual, it doesn't typically go month-to-month as we go through this, and there's not a holdover period necessarily either. So it either renews or it doesn't renew. And so the standard doesn't really address the question, but if we have an option that both the government and the vendor have the option to terminate, then in that scenario, it is a cancelable period and not included. So what does this mean? Well, that means that governments are going to have to really read the termination option. And the termination option is either going to be for one party or both parties. If it is both parties have the option to terminate, then it's just a short-term SBITA, right? Because that's a cancelable period. So if it's an option to terminate and then both people have the option to terminate, then it's a non-cancelable. Then we look at it as a cancelable period and it's excluded. Then in that scenario, it's just a short-term SBITA. So if you have a contract that says it, automatically renews at the end of the year, unless, but both the government and the vendor have the option to terminate, then it's just a short-term SBITA, because everything after that 1 year is an option to terminate for both parties. On the other hand, if only the government has the right to terminate and there's no indication that the vendor has the right to terminate, then in that scenario, it would be an option to terminate and would have to be evaluated for whether it's reasonably certain. And then we'd have to look at, well, how far ahead can you really be reasonably certain, right? So especially with software, because new options and new vendors and new technology comes along, right? Most people can't predict more than maybe 3 to 5 years from now. 3 years, I think, is a stronger point. But, when we think about technology, it changes so quickly. So the answer is it's not exactly clear. It really depends on the contract provision. So if it's an option that both the government and the SBITA vendor have the right to terminate, and that's just cancelable, short term, move on. If just the government has the right to terminate the contract, then we have to evaluate the length of the term. So I think this is going to be really important. The problem for a lot of these is that these terms and conditions are kind of vague. And so a lot of times when they're vague or they're unclear, that's going to either require a lawyer to get involved, or potentially the government confirming with the vendor who has, right? When it has a termination clause, but it's not clear who has the right, then maybe clarifying with the vendor. Maybe we clean up our contracts going forward as a result of this. Who knows? So there's a lot that can come from this, but I want people to really be aware that the only thing that we have concluded with this question is that automatic renewals are not perpetual, but we haven't really determined if they are going to be cancelable periods or non-cancelable, or the options to terminate as part of the consideration there for the term. So we have to really evaluate who has that option to terminate and kind of go from there. And I've heard a couple of different interpretations of this. And so I think they've done a nice job of at least clarifying a little bit as we move forward. So that's a wrap on today's blog. I want to thank you guys so much for joining me, and I hope to see you on a future blog. Have a great day, guys. Bye-bye.